Good morning. We're here now to open the second day of the conference, and we are opening with an exceptional guest, Mario Monti, first professor of economics at Bocconi, actually my professor of economics at Bocconi, and then, of course, European Commissioner, and then Italian Prime Minister. So there is hardly anybody better than him to start the second day. Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luigi. It's a real pleasure to be here. Last year at this conference, I was asked why the EU enforcement of competition tends to be, in general, since 15 or 20 years, more vigorous than the one elsewhere, particularly in the US. I provided some answers, which are partly institutional. Competition is, alongside with the more recent area of money and monetary policy and central banking, the one of the two really federal aspects that we have in the life of the EU. Then the decisions of the competition authority within the Commission stand. They have immediate legal effect. Of course, the parties can appeal against those decisions to the court, but until the moment when eventually, and if it is the case, the decisions are annulled, they stand. They have affected the economic and legal landscape. Also, very importantly, relative, for example, to the US, one cannot speak of political cycles in the handling of competition enforcement at the EU level. Even the relationship with the electoral processes and even the European elections that will happen in 10 days or so are much more indirect. And so these are some of the reasons. And yesterday, throughout the conversation in the day here, I did perceive an attitude vis-à-vis the EU, which is profoundly different from the one which I knew when I started my job as competition commissioner in Brussels. Namely, okay, we discuss, and then up there, remotely, there is the European Union, from which we may expect some incisive role, if not some guidance role. And I did notice, in particular in the discussion about competition and the digital platforms, this sort of demiurgical slash fatalistic expectation, because there is the EU out there. But I also said last year that yes, we have to expect the will of the European Commission to take on a more and more incisive role in the whole things pertaining regulation, including competition enforcement. But that when it comes to digital platforms, of course, we have to take into consideration non-technical aspects which are of huge importance, like most digital platforms tend to be US-based, and so there may be a deep risk of perception in case of a set of negative decisions by the European Commission in that area, and we have seen a number already, a perception that there is something protectionist or of industrial policy or anti-American and so on and so forth, which has to be factored in ahead of the whole decision-making process. Particularly, I think I said, if one or two jurisdictions are leaning towards declared or subliminal nationalism. Now, after 1 year, what can we say to this effect? And I will say these things also because, Luigi, I believe that in your fantastic project, I'm really impressed by the progress made in 1 year. unless I'm not well informed, there isn't really so far a portion dealing with the political economy and transnational aspects of enforcement, which I think would have to be taken on board sooner rather than later. If you want, eventually the recommendations to have a high degree of feasibility in this concrete world. Now, since last year, I think we can say that, yes, the EU has shown once again a determination to go ahead in becoming the standard for regulation. I will only mention the GDPR. And in the area of digital platforms, the Commission is better equipped now than it was last year this time. Why? Well, there is a human factor. We have seen a continued determination of Commissioner Vestager to this effect. But also there is now the analytical, highly coherent, it seems to me, framework in the report by Jacques Kremer and his colleagues, which is, of course, does not commit at all the Commissioner, but is a very interesting, I thought, blueprint. And one aspect which did occur since last year, actually a couple of months ago, I would like to particularly bring to your attention, because one key aspect in order to assess the criticisms veiled or explicit about protectionist, pro-European, anti-US attitude is the European Commission in the area of competition subject to economic and or political pressures by EU actors, by the member states, by the industrial and financial groups in Europe? Well, the case which is very telling from this point of view is a merger case, not concerning digital platforms, but a very classical industry. Well, one railroads on which in the US Antitrust had the opportunity to become adult, as was mentioned yesterday. The Siemens-Alstom merger was notified to Brussels. Of course, Siemens, the large German-based multinational by now, Alstom, equally French-based, and never was a merger case coming from Europe blessed with such a high charisma of political will by both countries, Germany and France, which, as you might know, are not the most irrelevant among all the equals which compose the EU, nor the least vocal. Well, the merger was deliberately engineered, one should use this word in this case, to set up a European champion, which has been for a long time a top priority of industrial policy, but also of identity policy of Germany and France. The pressures were huge. The merger was prohibited. The merger was prohibited by whom? By Commissioner Vestager. Is Commissioner Vestager in a retiring mood right now? Not exactly. She is candidate to become President of the European Commission, from whom will depend whether she succeeds or not in this rather natural ambition on the governments of member states, first and foremost the German and the French government. Both of them, particularly the French, as is in their style and in their recently shaped up Colbertian ideology, have been particularly tough on her. And they even have threatened to reconsider altogether the merger regulation, etc. For those of you who are perhaps equally interested in mergers as they are in digital platforms, relax. I hate unanimity because it blocks so frequently the progress of the EU, but in some cases unanimity is so nice. Now, in order to change the merger regulation, except in one aspect, which is the definition of the threshold for notifications to Brussels, which can go through with qualified majority of member states, but for any more substantial modification, you need unanimity. Good luck. And so that is not very likely to occur, even though it is now, if you look at the French government position paper in view of the next week's European elections, that is #1 priority, to allow European champions. By the way, I entered this debate, being of course miles away from the Commission or any responsibility. I noted that I think it's perfectly legitimate for Europe and European states to want to pursue European champions. Of course, what will become of them depends very much on the merits on which they are born and on whether or not their deliverance comes with huge deviations from the regulatory setup. And I said in the debate, suppose that Commissioner Vestager had been deferent to the will to set up this European champion. Okay, then the merger would have been approved after a huge debate in the press because it was not so obvious that it should have been approved. Now, if it is a European champion, it will have the vocation to operate with super high-speed trains and equipment throughout the world. So it might have to require the merger approval by the Washington authorities, the Beijing authority, the Tokyo authorities, etc. Can we reasonably expect those other players to be not just neutral in assessing the case, but deferent to the strong will of Europe to have a European champion? I don't believe we could have this expectation. So what would be the ultimate consequence? We just have to see in our common experience. When GE Honeywell, already approved by the Justice Department in 2001, came to Brussels and for a number of objective reasons which were upheld by the European Court of Justice, we denied authorization. Well, that merger was never consummated, not even in the US, because the economics of the merger, much to the regret of the legendary Jack Welch, would not have been there if they were prohibited to sell their aircraft engines and avionic equipments in the European market. So there are some self-correcting mechanisms in the working of antitrust laws which prevent huge deviations from good practice. But now, so I point to this Siemens-Alstom case because for it, the Commission and the Commissioner have been sharply criticized in the EU, but I think it's a strong point to show elsewhere as proof of independence. So this reduces the probability that a priori a decision from Brussels which is tough on other players, on non-European players, can be said to be, of course, biased in favor of Europe or European governments. Now, so all the prerequisites are there to have in the EU the little modest guiding star for enforcement of digital platforms in the future. Well, I think some objective reasons are there, but please, let's not forget the populistic and nationalistic component here. How do I perceive, I may be totally wrong, the impact of rising populism on the ability to enforce competition vigorously? Here I see a paradox. If I were a digital platform, probably US-based, an ever-increasing degree of populism in the US would scare me a bit from the point of view of increasing the likelihood of more vigorous regulation, but also antitrust enforcement. Does the same thing hold true for Europe? More populism in Europe, as we are seeing largely these days, and nationalism. Would that equally bring to a more aggressive attitude? I'm not so sure, because the nationalism you have in the US, which goes hand in hand with populism, is an America First type of nationalism. In Europe, it's not really a Europe First type of nationalism. It's perhaps France First or Flanders First. So the scale is different, the ambition is the same, but the scale is different. This means that my own main concern as to the future of the EU as a whole, as well as in particular for the strength of competition policy in the EU, is that the more we were to see nationalism jumping ahead, paradoxically, not so paradoxically after all, the bigger the threat to the acceptance over time of a powerful non-political competition enforcement out of Brussels. So we have to take this very, very seriously. At any rate, these are the likely consequences of more populism and nationalism on the likelihood of vigorous competition enforcement. But then there is the feedback effect. Suppose that, irrespective of what happens to European nationalists and populists, the Commission continues in its determined pace and becomes more and more a reference point in enforcing the digital platforms. Well, what will be the reaction in the US if that becomes serious? And I'm not pronouncing in favor or against ex ante on structural remedies and the breaking up of companies. Just to make sure that was a legal, open and explicit possibility when we reviewed well, in Regulation 1, 2003, setting up the so-called modernization of competition policy in Europe, we explicitly provided as a remedy of last resort for the power of the Commission to break up. So, imagining that, I don't know, in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, the community emanating from the Stigler Center and the residual rest of the antitrust thought community around the world came to the conclusion that in some cases structural breakups are the way to go. Well, I wish good luck to the Commissioner in Brussels applying such a structural remedy to a US-based large digital platforms. The reactions will be not insignificant, I believe. And so I think this brings upon all of us who are interested under various angles in these issues to to prepare the ground intellectually and politically for whatever landscape there might be in the future. Maybe it's very presumptuous to make a proposal in relation to the great work which is going on here by the Committee for the Study of Digital Platforms, but why would you not consider in the context of this study a set of reflections on approximating the actual political economic landscape for whatever proposal you may come forward with? What would be the points of difficulty in the international political scenario, how to address them? For example, would it make sense to try and work out, I don't believe that the competition authorities themselves, which have a great degree of cooperation, could do that in the first place. Maybe a place like here could work intellectually on an informal understanding of some principles guiding antitrust enforcement for digital platforms. I'm not referring, because that you are doing it already, on which should be the actions taken, but how the climate around those potential actions, if you are compelling intellectually and your line one day is followed, how that can go through without destroying what is left of a good faith transatlantic cooperation, and how could one day China be embraced in this? And my very last note is that I would find such an ex ante forward-looking reflection particularly interesting, because I must say, when I listened yesterday to the idea of the how was it, digital authority or digital agency, great. But we all know that in this world there is regulatory capture. My own experience in Europe, even within the European Commission, is that the broader the remit of a commissioner, and for the competition commissioner that is 360 degrees, unlike for the transport, the energy, the agriculture commissioner, the broader the remit and the more removed you are physically and politically from the place where the decision has its impact, here subsidiarity works in the reverse. Subsidiarity tells us it is appropriate to make decisions at the closest, at the nearest possible level to the place. But of course, in terms of lobbying and of capturing, for example, in Europe, it's much easier not to be captured if you sit in Brussels than if you sit in a national capital. And so, from the point of view of not being captured, can I say that the digital agency seems to me, only from this point of view, the least promising avenue. The most promising avenue would be, pure intellectually, the European Commission, namely somebody which is outside reach, which has, however, the legal powers under certain conditions to operate, including, you know, when a market is defined to be global, you know the consequences. So I'm not saying that antitrust should outsource to Brussels for the digital platforms, but at least prepare the conditions for a mutually agreed understanding on how to go about this business. And then this might work the other way around if a case happens to be centered in Washington. So I apologize for this daring intrusion into an agenda of this committee, which I will, if Luigi allows me, continue to follow from far away with interest and admiration. Thank you very much.